All right, thank you very much. Well, it is my honor and pleasure to introduce you to Phil Chard. Phil is what I would call a Renaissance man. He is an excellent writer, an excellent speaker, an excellent psychotherapist and trainer. And I want to put in a plug. If you are not signed up for his regular weekly column, Out of My Mind, all you have to do is go to philipchard.com. And I will tell you personally, every Sunday when that appears, it is a highlight of my day, because as a former middle school English teacher, there's a very small number of people who are good writers, who can be entertaining, humorous, as well as serious. And I've had the pleasure of hearing Phil speak before, so no pressure, but Phil is a very engaging speaker. And Phil, it's my pleasure to introduce you at this time. If people want to write questions in the chat, you can. Otherwise, we are going to be doing small groups, and we are going to give Phil an opportunity to do some Q&A after he helps us understand what it is to be a realistic optimist, which I don't think anybody would be on this meeting if you weren't already in that category. So Phil, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Larry. Appreciate it. Thanks everyone for being here, wherever here is when you're on Zoom. Just a couple of quick housekeeping things, if I could. One is that I'm recovering from something, all the things that are going around. So if my voice sounds a little hoarse, I apologize. And the other thing, which is perhaps more important, is that I have two cats in the room with me. And so, cats run the house, the owner doesn't. So if they decide to disrupt things, I apologize in advance. I'm going to be showing you a PowerPoint in a moment. And in that PowerPoint, I'll be covering a number of points related to this attribute we call realistic optimism. I'm also going to show you a few videos that I think illustrate some of the points in there. And I hope that you'll find things in here that will be helpful for you in your own self-care efforts. We all kind of need that even more so over the holidays, I think. But this is applicable really year-round. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that screen share, if you'll bear with me for a moment. And there we are. I hope you can all see that. Good. Okay, so just to start out, realistic optimism is a well-researched capacity that we have discovered seems to be the most effective way for us to handle the challenges that come our way as a result of imposed change. It's one thing when we make a decision to do something that changes our lives, even if it's difficult, but it's something altogether when the changes come at us from outside of ourselves and we feel like we have minimal control over when those show up, how intense they are, and the way they affect us. So realistic optimism is a set of attitudes and behaviors that really help us to meet these very significant challenges in our lives. What I'm going to be showing you is all the attributes that are associated with this capacity. This is evidence-based stuff. I didn't make it up. I didn't, pull it out of GQ or Cosmopolitan or something like that. So I think you can kind of rely on this as information that works for a lot of people. Doesn't work for everybody all the time. There are no panaceas, but it does seem to be an effective way for us to manage change when it is imposed upon us. So kind of to start out, I'd like to focus first on what we're up against. And the things I've listed for you here are really the primary challenges that we have seen people experience over the last few years. Many of these are related to the pandemic, but they're also related to other things going on in our lives. The economic distress many folks are feeling, the climate crisis, the global, divisions, the political divisions that we're experiencing. All of these things have kind of created this stew, if you will, of toxic influences that have made it more difficult for us to maintain our own well-being. I don't want to go down this list, one by one and give you sort of death by PowerPoint here, but I want to just touch on a couple of these real quickly. First of all, the one that we're finding that's really difficult for people is second on your list there. That's uncertainty. In general, we people don't like uncertainty. We like to tell ourselves we know what's coming, that we can accurately predict, the future, because that gives us a sense of calm about what's going on. But when things show up in our lives that show us that we're not very good at predicting what's coming, and that things just come out of nowhere, the pandemic being kind of a good example of that, then we're really taxed to maintain our own well-being and not go into a fear state, an anxiety state that makes it difficult for us to handle other issues. The other thing we've seen that's come along with the pandemic, and interestingly enough has actually persisted through most of it, is a sense of loneliness and isolation that many people have felt. This was more acute, of course, early on, but it has persisted for many folks as well, who have chosen to reduce their social interaction or their public presence as a result of concerns about their own health. The collective experience we're having is something we refer to as existential angst. It's kind of when you pile on with all these different issues and all these challenges, after a while, we begin to feel like we don't really have a steady foundation, if you will, underneath us, that, the tectonic plates, if you will, of our existence are creaking and cracking and moving. And that gives us a background sense of anxiety. Therapists, I've one, of course, and I've talked to many of my colleagues about this, have been reporting that when people come to them now with their personal problem, something they want to deal with, obviously, in therapy, this background sense of angst is always there, and it seems to feed into and amplify the personal concerns that we have. So people are dealing not only as much with their personal stuff as they are also dealing with this sense of, wow, the sky is falling kind of sense. The other thing we're seeing more and more of that's difficult for people is something called moral injury. And that's where people feel like they are being compelled to act in ways that somehow go against or violate their values or principles. And we're seeing and hearing about a lot more of that from people in the healthcare professions, feeling like the duress and the complexity of what they're up against makes it difficult for them to practice in the ways that they would otherwise. We also are seeing compassion fatigue. This is something probably many of you are familiar with. When you're a caregiver, when you are in the services professions, you're very much at risk for developing compassion fatigue after a period of time. And so we're going to look at that. We're going to look at all of these kind of issues. But what I don't want to do is spend the whole time with you telling you how terrible everything is. I used to go to stress management workshops, and one of the things I noticed about them, maybe you had an hour, and they'd spend the first 55 minutes having us take tests and all these things to show us just how absolutely stressed out we were. And then they'd only spend the last 5 minutes telling us what to do about it. So I'm going to try to avoid that. But I think the overall overarching issue here is sort of epitomized by this quote by Viktor Frankl, who many of you know wrote Man's Search for Meaning. And he says, when we're no longer able to change something outside of ourselves, these things being imposed upon us, then the challenge becomes, how do I manage myself? When I can't manage my environment as much as I'd like, how do I keep that from taking me over and being managed by the things outside of me? So we're going to look at that pretty closely as well. So a few scary statistics. We always like to start with scary statistics. What we've noticed in the survey work is that the rates of anxiety and depression in the general population have exploded since the beginning of the pandemic, going from about 11% up to over 41%. Anxiety's increased on average by 26% across the population. We're seeing more of this in women and in younger people, though we do think that the females being higher in this category is partly a result of the fact that males don't report it as much. So my guess is that it's pretty evenly distributed across gender. Depression's also up significantly, and we're seeing a lot more of this in people who are lower income, because not only do they have the emotional stressors that all of us are experiencing, but they also have significant financial stressors as well. One of the interesting side notes to this is that there are generational differences in how people have been responding to not only the pandemic, but the broader challenges we're up against. You can see from this bar graph here that the older folks, interestingly enough, those that have been most affected physically and medically by the pandemic are actually doing better emotionally than the younger generations. And you can probably figure out why without too much noodling on it. It's really a function of life experience. The more life experience you've had, the more difficult things you've had to deal with, the more you can draw on that to address the current issue. And when you don't have as much life experience, you don't have that bank, if you will, or that library of experiences to pull from and say, been through tough times before, we'll get through this, we'll figure it out, that sort of thinking. So that's one of the other things we're seeing that's unique to this period of time. And the final thing I wanted to address in the problem issue before we start looking at solutions is compassion fatigue. This is, of course, a state of an emotional state, really, is experienced by people who are dealing with other folks and sometimes animals as well that are in distress. And if you are an empathic person, or what some people refer to as a highly sensitive person, then your risk of compassion fatigue is very high. And I'm guessing some of us out there have experienced this in varying degrees. I know I certainly have. And I love that quote there by Rachel Naomi Remen, who wrote Kitchen Table Wisdom. She said, the idea we can be immersed in suffering and loss and not be touched by it is like thinking you can walk through water and not get wet. I want to make a side note here about this. I mentioned highly sensitive people, and that's a designation that applies to roughly 20% of the population. These people tend to gravitate more towards service work, being caregivers and helpers, and that means they also then get exposed a lot more to suffering in other people, and they don't have the kind of emotional armor, if you want to think of it that way, that allows them to fend off a lot of that. So they tend to absorb this suffering into themselves and experience it vicariously, if you will, in relation to the people they're serving. So I'm going to show you one of those videos now. And in this video, you're going to see people from Children's Hospital in Colorado, healthcare providers, talking about their experiences with compassion fatigue. And while you may not be in healthcare or even a direct caregiver, I think as you listen to their remarks, I'd invite you to zero in on the things they talk about that are applicable to you as well, that you've experienced in your own way and in your own context. So let's take a look-see at this video.
I feel very in touch with compassion fatigue awareness because it's a special interest of mine, just helping care providers take care of ourselves.
Instead of saying, I can give no more, we just continue to give.
Of all the things that I've experienced between myself or coworkers and realize, wow, that's what compassion fatigue is.
I think what people end up doing is they internalize it.
I think it's our culture to feel like we need to be tough.
You have to get through your shift, you have to get everyone else through the shift. So a lot of times you'll take whatever emotional turmoil you went through and stuff it down and pretend you'll deal with it later.
I can think of many instances where I paused at the door and said, can I think of an excuse not to go into this room? But that's not what this job is, and that's not really what we want to do. So you go into the rooms and you try to do the best that you can do.
And I think those people that need it the most are probably the least inclined to stop and say, I need help, this is hard.
There's always, the first death you ever experience. I can still remember, pulling a barrette out of this little girl's hair. It's those moments that put the humanness into it, because you think, we had done everything we could as a team to save this little life. And as we were cleaning her up to get her ready for her family to come see her, I find this barrette in her hair and I think, oh my gosh, somebody put that in her hair. That was her mom. I'm sure when she did that, she did not think that'd be the last time she ever got to do that. So that was 14 years ago.
I have a heavy heart. Yeah, I carry it with me. I think about it. I think about it when I'm going to bed at night.
I would never want to give that moment up. I think it helps turn you from a task-oriented provider to really focusing, when you can, to the humanness of it.
It's heartbreaking because I have 2 children, boys who are 6 and 7 years old. And it's very easy to quickly put yourself in the place of this parent and what they're going through. It's a difficult balance because you want to feel enough emotion and empathy and compassion and connect with what's going on with patients and their families, but not have it be so overwhelming that you can't do your job.
You're going into a room that there's either anger or pain or some sort of suffering that you don't know how to help with. And you do pause before you go into the room and say, can I, because you want to make a difference, and can I make a difference in this room? And you can't always make the difference that you want to make.
We see everything. It's hard to even communicate that at home to your spouse because they just don't understand what you deal with.
There's always an emotional attachment to wanting people to be better.
And we spend so much effort taking care of the patient and taking care of the patient's family, but we have very little time to take care of ourselves.
There is a limit to the amount of care you can give somebody else unless you take care of yourself fully first.
You're not validating what you did as a profession, which is amazing. We do amazing work.
So I'm imagining as you listen to that you could relate in your own context and your own way to some of what you were hearing there. And, there's a number of points related to that I think are really important to touch on. One of them, as you may have heard the one nurse talking about, we realize that we're suffering along with these people that we're working with in our own way, but we push it aside, we compartmentalize it, and we tell ourselves, I'll deal with it later, and we get busy and we don't. The other thing is, that's sort of I'll put myself second or maybe last and put other people first, and highly sensitive people tend to do that. Empathy, as was referred to throughout, of course, is that capacity where we identify with something in ourselves that echoes what we're experiencing with this other person. So it puts us in touch with our own pain as well as their pain. It's almost a doubling down effect. And this issue about taking care of ourselves then becomes front and center. How do we do that? Because we all know that if we don't, we will eventually reach that place where we no longer can be of service to other people and even to ourselves at the same time. So what do you do about it? That's where I want to go next. Realistic optimists incorporate not all of these approaches. So if you're looking down this list and going, well, I don't have that one. Well, I don't have that one. Don't get too concerned. They embrace many of these attributes, but not all of them. And so we're going to go through these kind of one at a time. I'm going to illustrate them for you and invite you to think about whether or not, first of all, you are doing one of these attributes. And if you're not, whether or not you think it would be a benefit to you to consider adopting it as an approach to being a realistic optimist. A realistic optimist, what the heck is that? Well, we all know about the pie in the sky optimist, right? Everything's fine, don't worry about a thing, it'll all turn out okay. That sort of pie in the sky positivity that sometimes gets kind of toxic if you experience too much of it. We also know about people on the other end of the continuum who are very pessimistic, you know, the sky is falling, nothing will help, you know, what's the use kind of thing. Realistic optimists live between those two polarities, and they move a little bit one way and the other sometimes, but they are hopeful people. But their hope is grounded in the realities that they face, rather than just spinning off into a don't worry about a thing kind of attitude. So that's what distinguishes them from those other two types, if you will. So first off, what we know is that realistic optimists maintain a clear sense of purpose. They have this idea about why they're doing the work they are, what meaning and purpose it fulfills, and that helps them when things go poorly. It's almost like an anchor that holds a ship in place in a tempest. Okay, that sense of purpose allows us to go on when things get really tough. You know, there's a saying that suffering is very difficult when it has no meaning attached to it. When you can attach some meaning or purpose to your suffering and to your challenges, it somehow makes it easier to prevail. But when it seems senseless, then that quickly zaps our capacity to engage in the kind of work that we do. You know, Friedrich Nietzsche, the philosopher, who wasn't exactly a positive guy, he said, those who have a why, meaning a purpose, to live for can bear almost any how, so, or set of circumstances. So again, having a clear sense of that and keeping it in our consciousness, revisiting it sometimes, reminding ourselves. I've even had people put up little, write out what they call a personal mission statement and put it up somewhere where they can see it every day, to kind of remind them, yeah, this is why I'm doing what I'm doing. And when things get tough, I remember that I am suffering for a reason. I'm not just suffering, you know, for its own sake. So purpose is a really important element in the realistic optimist's armamentum. The other one we see is that these folks who have this attribute are resilient. You know, and we know resilience is that capacity to kind of bounce back when life knocks us down, which it does to all of us. And, you know, it's surprising. We tend to think that resilience is sort of the province of a few people who are really good at it, but our research shows that resilience is actually a pretty common capacity. And that if we invest in it and help to grow it, we can build on that innate capacity that's already there. One of the most interesting pieces of research that I've seen recently looked at through a meta-analysis, looked at what's the most critical thing we can do to build our personal resilience. And I was surprised by the findings, as many behavioral scientists were. And what the findings basically said was learning is the most powerful way to build personal resilience. So learning something new, it kind of wakes up the brain. It makes us more flexible and allows us to adapt more readily to circumstances. So just learning something new or being what we call a lifelong learner is highly correlated with resilience. The other thing we see when we look at resilient people is that they use something called positive energy rituals. These are, and I'll give you a list of these in a moment, these are behaviors that build up our reserves of energy within ourselves, which we know can really get depleted when we're up against tough stuff or we're dealing with people who are struggling and we're trying to help them. So positive energy rituals is a way to kind of refill our tanks when they get low or empty. And then, of course, we have the usual things that they always tell us to do to be resilient, which is, you know, do your best to maintain your physical well-being, you know, eat well, do the things your mother told you, you know, get plenty of sleep. Those are all important, but the things that are most critical, we find, are keeping the brain fresh and young by learning new things, and also taking time to reinvest in our own energy renewal. So how do you do that? Well, here's a list of positive energy rituals. And again, I'm not going to go through all of these, but I want to highlight a few for you. One of the things the behavioral science tells us is that expressive activities really give us energy back. So whether maybe you play a piano, or you like to draw, or you enjoy writing or journaling, or you have hobbies that are creative, whatever it is, when we take this time to take what's inside of us and give it outward expression, if you will, through some creative act, that helps fill up our energy tanks. Now, if you're an extroverted kind of person, you also tend to get a lot of energy by interacting with other people. But if you're more of an introverted sort of person, while you may like interacting with other people, it drains energy out of you. So if you know that about yourself, if you know you're an extrovert, and you need a little energy hit, if it will, go talk to and engage with some people that you enjoy, and that will give that to you. But if you're an introvert and your tanks are kind of empty, then what you really need is some downtime. You need that time to maybe do something creative or reflect or engage in your own form of leisure. So that's important. Laughter also fills our tanks. I don't know if you heard that, but my watch just started talking to me. So, we're all victims of technology these days. At any rate, laughter is one of those things that fills the tanks up. So if you know people that make you laugh, or movies or whatever that, are funny for you, that's another way to do it. We know that exercise is important. There was a meta study that came out recently showing that cardio exercise reduces anxiety and depression from your baseline by 60%. That's huge in my business. So exercise is a real powerful way to refill your tanks. You may think, well, your exercise, you're actually expending energy, true, but it also gives it to you back. You get a net gain, kind of like the fusion experiment they announced today. Sleep's important, and over 42% of Americans are sleep deprived. So that's an important piece. And then investing in our spiritual life, whatever that is to you, through meditation or prayer or gratitude work. And then finally on this list, nature. Now let's look at that one in particular, because it's a really easy and important way to get that energy back. We know that when we immerse ourselves in the natural world, even on a bad day, as we define it, cold or windy or wet or whatever, it enhances our mood. People may complain when they come in because it's cold or it's wet outside, but if you ask them, they'll tell you, I feel more alive. I feel more refreshed. So energy comes from that nature immersion. It also is known to diminish hurry sickness, which many of us have these days, rushing all the time. It promotes emotional healing for those of us that have been wounded, and generally gives us a sense that things are okay. So it pushes back against that existential angst I was referring to earlier. In Japan and parts of Western Europe and South Korea, physicians, when they see stressed out patients, they actually write out a prescription for them, and on it, they tell them to go forced bathing. Now, I'm not a big fan of the term forced bathing because you don't have to do it in a forest. I like nature immersion, but whatever works. And what we know is that forced bathing is really a way to go out into nature, whatever the setting may be, and to open your senses and drink in, if you will, the natural world around you. So if you're going to go outside and put some earbuds in and listen to music, and that's not going to do it. You have to connect with the natural world in a very engaged way to get this effect. Well, you know that this nature immersion, if you will, actually resets the central nervous system. We can see this in neurological studies, where the brain, if it's really in an excited mode, it's kind of agitated kind of mode, it calms down. If the brain's in more of a depressed mode, it wakes it up. And so this is really a way to kind of reset our brain and our central nervous system when it's not working as well as we'd like. It was interesting that during particularly the early stages of the pandemic, when many of us were isolating out of necessity, lots of folks went outdoors more because that was a place they could feel safe, and they got more of an experience of how powerful this nature effect can be. I'm kind of a nature nut, And when I was going out at that period of time, it kind of ticked me off because it was, so what are all these people doing out here? But it was a good thing overall because I really feel it helped connect us back to this tremendous source of healing that's around us all the time. So the other thing that we see in realistic optimists is they embrace something called a growth mindset. And you can see, I'm not going to again read this to you, but you can see from this list of attributes the difference between someone that has a growth mindset, meaning they're a lifelong learner, and somebody who has a fixed one, who's kind of closed the book on learning anything new, kind of on autopilot, and just sort of goose-stepping their way through life, if you will. A growth mindset is very critical to realistic optimism for one particular reason. That fourth attribute down on the list, when I fail, I learn. And so realistic optimists are not so much about winning or succeeding or getting the outcome that they want. We're going to touch on that more in just a moment. They're really more about their effort. I try hard, that's what really matters, as opposed to I got the A or I succeeded or I won the gold medal. It's I did my best. And that's what's consistent with a growth mindset. So nobody spends all of their time in a growth mindset. We pop in and out of this a little bit sometimes, but if that tends to be your default mode, then you're part of the way towards being this thing called a realistic optimist. That leads to what we call locus of control. This is an example, locus of control is an example of terms. People in my profession are infamous for this. We make up ways of talking to you about things you already know and put it into words you can't understand. So we'll say locus of control, and we go, whoa, what's that? Well, it's really kind of simple. If you have what we call an external locus of control, it's an attitude or a perception that says whatever's going on out here around me determines what's going on inside of me. In other words, my external environment is in charge of my mood and my attitude and maybe even my behavior. So we're kind of a puppet on the string of circumstance, if you want to think of it that way. If you have, however, an internal locus of control, which is associated with a growth mindset, then even when things are crazy out here, you feel this capacity to regulate how you're doing inside. So it's what we call a stance of agency, meaning I can make a difference, at least internally, if not externally. Whereas when we're in victim mode, it's bad out here, bad in here. Now, again, nobody spends all their time in one or the other of these. We tend to move back and forth depending on a variety of variables. And it's okay to feel like a victim once in a while when things are really tough and you've had a hard week or hard day or whatever. That's just human. Our saying about it is it's okay to visit Pity City, just don't move there. Okay, so basically agency is what we see more often than not, never 100%, in realistic optimists. How powerful is our mindset in determining our response to challenges? It's huge. And I'm going to show you another video now that was actually, it's a short clip from a TED Talk that was done where there's a health psychologist talking about the impact of stress. And she's referring to a study that was actually done at the University of Wisconsin. I think you'll find this interesting from the standpoint of how powerful perspective and attitude is on determining the way we react physically and emotionally to the stresses around us. So here we go with this one.
Let me start with the study that made me rethink my whole approach to stress. This study tracked 30,000 adults in the United States for 8 years. And they started by asking people, how much stress have you experienced in the last year? They also asked, do you believe that stress is harmful for your health? And then they used public death records to find out who died. Okay, some bad news first. People who experienced a lot of stress in the previous year had a 43% increased risk of dying. But that was only true for the people who also believed that stress is harmful for your health. People who experienced a lot of stress but did not view stress as harmful were no more likely to die. In fact, they had the lowest risk of dying of anyone in the study, including people who had relatively little stress. Now, the researchers estimated that over the 8 years they were tracking deaths, 182,000 Americans died prematurely, not from stress, but from the belief that stress is bad for you. That is over 20,000 deaths a year. Now, if that estimate is correct, that would make believing stress is bad for you the 15th largest cause of death in the United States last year, killing more people than skin cancer, HIV, AIDS, and homicide. You can see why this study freaked me out. Here I've been spending so much energy telling people stress is bad for your health. So this study got me wondering, can changing how you think about stress make you healthier? And here the science says yes. When you change your mind about stress, you can change your body's response to stress.
And we know that the primary mechanism for changing your mind about how you see stress is what I just talked to you about, locus of control. So if you have a sense of agency, I'm not going to let the world run me, I'm going to run me. If you have that sense of agency, then even when you're under stress, you are subconsciously telling yourself, this is going to be okay. It's not going to be that bad. It's not going to hurt me. I'm going to get through this. If, however, you're in victim mode, you're telling yourself, this is going to kill me, and maybe it will. So that's the difference. And you can see how powerful that is. It actually is a life and death effect for some people. So if we kind of lose it, we lose that internal capacity to manage our own internal state. How do we snap out of it? Well, I've already given you some of the ways that are more long-term, but here are some ways that are very short-term. So let's say you're having a bad day, or let's say somebody does something that really pushes one of your hot buttons and you kind of lose it. You know, you become, as we say, emotionally hijacked. Okay. How can we pop ourselves out of victim and into agency rapidly? And we know there are 6 primary ways to do this, again, backed by the science. One of them is called power posing. Some of you may have heard of this. It's actually been dueling studies, if you will, but the studies now seem to be leaning towards, yeah, it really works. And power posing is kind of the Wonder Woman pose, as you can see there. It's just a way of using our physiology to restore a sense of confidence and being grounded and centered within ourselves. So you just stand in that way, solid, confident, that kind of thing. And it actually, you say, well, so what's that going to do? It actually changes the way the brain operates a little bit. And so you begin to feel more confident, even if you're faking it till you make it. You start to feel, I got this. And that will help to walk you back down off of whatever hijacking you've experienced. The other way that's very powerful for doing this is a 1-minute method called coherent breathing, which I will give you a little bit more on in just a moment. Another one is what we call a sensory hit. This relates back to nature immersion because nature really wakes up the senses. But one of the ways you can wake up your senses is just splash cold water on your face. I know this sounds kind of simplistic and silly, but what it does is it activates the vagus nerve in the body and relaxes us more. So sometimes if you're really upset, just go into the bathroom, turn the cold water on, start splashing cold water on your face. Oh, as a sidebar to this, some researchers have also found you can activate the vagal relaxation response by doing other weird things, gargling, singing out loud, which I know many of you do in the car. That kind of thing also relaxes us. Nature time, I referenced, if you know music that kind of brings you back into yourself when you've lost it, that's an excellent way. And the other way is micro exercise. When we get really upset about something, our body's reacting to it, not just our mind. And the body has kind of got all this energy bound up in it, and it's rattling around in there, if you will. And when we do a short burst of exercise, it releases that tension and that energy and gives us a chance to reset. So you can see a picture of Michelle Obama there doing push-ups. That's an example of that. Push-ups, crunches, run up and down the stairs, whatever it takes to just get the heart pumping is generally going to offload some of that tension and allow us to kind of reset and get back into an internal locus of control. Okay, a couple of other things that we know realistic optimists do. They manage their thinking. You know, we're all talking to ourselves in our head much of the time. And I love that quote there, you know, be careful how you're talking to yourself because you are listening. You know, even if you're not consciously listening, it's sort of operating in the background. Part of your mind's paying attention to what you're saying to yourself. And if you find yourself doing a lot of negative thinking or catastrophizing, I can be really good at that sometimes. It can help to reset that by challenging it. Just speak to yourself as your best friend would. You know, you've heard them talk you down off the ledge before. So kind of incorporate their own way of talking into your own head and use it on yourself. And sometimes it helps to just say these thoughts out loud. It makes them more real. Sometimes you can realize how you're a little over the top with what you're catastrophizing about, and you can kind of walk yourself back from that. You know, that quote there from the Buddha, he said, "You are what you think, having become what you thought." And we know, any therapists out there in the audience know this too, that a lot of things start up here. They start with way we're talking to ourselves about a situation, then evokes how we feel about the situation, then causes how we act in relation to it. So a lot of it starts with thought, and realistic optimists, they pay attention to that subvocal thought. And when they hear it go negative, they challenge it. Now, when you do enough negative thinking, you can develop something that is antithetical to realistic optimism, and that is a negative cognitive bias. There's another one of those terms, psychobabble terms. But a negative cognitive bias simply means our brain is now sorting for what's wrong, what's dangerous, what's risky, and it's ignoring positives around us. So the brain can, you know, sort of gradually devolve into this negative perceptual place where all it sees is bad stuff. And when we fall into that, and things like compassion fatigue and burnout can put us there, we need to somehow restore a more positive cognitive bias, meaning the ability to see the good, not just the bad or the dangerous out there. And we do know that the most powerful way to restore a positive cognitive bias is through gratitude journaling. So I'm going to give you a little quick primer on that. You may have heard about gratitude journaling. It's really easy to do, and it takes a minimal amount of time and has a major impact. The studies done on it show, interestingly enough, I'll just give you an example of one study. They took a group of people who were either depressed or anxious or very negative, whatever, and they measured that anxiety at baseline at the beginning of the study. Then they had them do gratitude journaling for 6 weeks. At the end of the 6 weeks, they measured those emotional markers again and found that they were much better, that they had switched from a negative cognitive bias to a positive one. And they told them to stop doing it, no more gratitude journaling. And they had them wait 6 weeks, brought them back in and measured them again. And what they found was that that positive effect was highly durable. Even after they stopped doing it, it lasted quite a ways out in time. Now, here's the good news. It's easy to do. And one of the easiest ways to do it, backed by the science, is you get yourself a little journal, put it somewhere, you know, you're going to look at it every day. And when you wake up in the morning, you take a couple of minutes just to jot down, it doesn't even have to be a sentence, it can be a few words or a bullet point, something in your life that you're grateful for in general. Could be something that happened when you were 5 years old. Any time in your life, you look back, you say, oh yeah, I remember that. That was a wonderful moment, or this person really helped me out there. Whatever it is, something from the background of your life. Then that same evening, before you go to bed, you make one other entry. And that entry is something that happened during that day that you feel grateful for. And here's the even better news about this. Don't do it every day. It actually works better if you do it every other day or every third day, probably because you don't get used to it as much and it doesn't become sort of a routine. So gratitude journaling, if you're in that negative cognitive place, which we can all get into when we get up against enough challenges, this is going to pull you out of it pretty rapidly, and it's going to keep you out of it on a long-term basis. Okay. The other thing we know is that realistic optimists tend to be giving people. Mostly they're kind, and they extend that kindness to others. And what we know about extending kindness to others is that it creates a positive feedback loop. What we give, we get, so we're not only helping them, we're helping us at the same time. Now I'm talking about acts of kindness here. Certainly there are times when we're in service to others and we're being kind, but it's still draining a lot of our energy. But there are also times when we can be kind to people, even strangers, and that will flow back to us as a positive experience, okay? And we all remember this quote from the late, great Maya Angelou, that people forget what you said and did, but they don't forget how you make them feel. Nor do you forget how you make them feel. That's where the positive feedback loop comes into play. So I'm going to show you another short video. You're not going to be able to understand the words in this one because it's not in English unless you speak this language. But I think this really illustrates the power of kindness to influence our emotional state. You're going to be seeing a gentleman who is HIV positive. And he goes out into a public square and he puts a sign down asking people to touch him. And then he waits to see who will and who won't. And what I want you to notice more than anything else as you watch this video is the reactions on the faces of the people who decide not to touch him versus those who decide to touch him. Okay? So just take a look for that. Here we go.
No ei se nyt tunnu enää niin pahalle. Tästä on 8 vuotta sitten aikaa jo, että tää nyt on ihan silleen tutuksi tullut jo tää asia mulle, mutta kun se ei edelleenkään jo tuttu kaikille, niin ihan hyvä. Että mä en ole vaarallinen ihminen enkä tartutakaan ihmisiä sillä, että voidaan ihan kosketellakin. Kiitos. Oi. Kiitos paljon teille, kiitos.
Hyvää kesää, tsemppiä.
Kiitos samoin, kiitos. Oi.
Hei.
Ei, kiitos. Kiitos, thank you. Hyvä. Kiitos. Kiitos. Kiitos.
Kiitos.
Kiitos. Kiitos. Kiitos.
So we hope to heal ourselves when we also do something that's healing to someone else. And so realistic optimists, they're aware of this dynamic. It's part of who they are, it's part of their value system, and they practice it. And you can see the effects there for yourself. The other thing we know about realistic optimists is that they're actually present. You can tell when you're with them because they're actually with you. There was a Harvard study done not too long ago that showed that we are distracted 47% of the time. Okay, meaning we're not really engaged with whatever's right here, right now. We're mentally ahead of ourselves or behind ourselves, which means that the next time you go out to lunch with somebody, there's only a 50-50 chance they're actually there. Okay, but the point is, present people or engaged people are also people who have this resilience capacity in them because they're engaged with life. They're not off on some, cognitive fantasy somewhere or some memory train. They're actually doing what's happening right here and right now. And the benefits of this are huge. And one of the three different ways that we can get to being more present with people is to practice one of these approaches. Coherent breathing, which I'm going to give you a descriptor of here shortly. Mindful habits, which simply means doing the things you do every day, but being present when you do them. So, good example of that, you're in the shower. Are you paying attention to what it's like to take a shower? Are you feeling the water and the sound? And no, most of us are off thinking, what am I going to have for lunch? Or what am I going to say to my boss? Or, we go on these mental trips. If we become present and mindful when we do regular daily things, that starts to spread out. It becomes the default mode in the brain. And pretty soon we're much more present-centered, even when we're not thinking about it or trying to do it intentionally. Those of you who are meditators know the power of meditation to help us be present. But if you really want the quick and easy way to do it, it's something called coherent breathing. And that's what this is right here. If you're interested in reading up on the science behind this, go to the New York Times website and in the search engine, put in coherent breathing, and you'll see a wonderful summary of all the science that supports the efficacy of this approach. But it's basically those deep belly breaths that you're supposed to take all the time, and most of us don't, where you completely fill the lungs and you pause very quickly, and then you exhale longer than you inhale. You breathe in through the nose, you breathe out through open lips. 6 breaths will usually do it. Takes about a minute. And what we see happening in the brain when people do this is they go from agitated to calmer. They go from depressed to more uplifted. It kind of clears the emotional residue that we've been carrying around from the day's events and gives us a fresh start. And if you have a lot of difficult interactions with people, and you feel for these people and you absorb a lot of that suffering and negativity into yourself, this is an excellent way to offload it because it kind of clears the emotional cache, again, out of the brain and lets us start anew, if you will. Use this a lot with healthcare providers in between patient visits or psychotherapists being client visits. This is a really effective way to not have at the end of the day a huge collection of emotional residue bearing down on you and kind of crushing you under its weight. I was in the Milwaukee airport a number of years ago on my way to a backpacking trip, and I was loaded down with gear. I had a big rolling duffel and another suitcase and a backpack on, and I was just struggling through the airport. And this older gentleman came the other way who had nothing in his hands, and he stopped me and he goes, "Wait a minute." I stopped and he goes, "Do you know what the Latin word is for baggage?" Well, I studied Latin for 4 years, but I didn't know what it was. And so anyway, he said, impedimenta. And he's right. That emotional baggage impedes us. It weighs us down. It makes it impossible for us to do our work. So this is a way to get through that. And finally, the last kind of piece I want to touch on before we wrap up is what we call effort over outcome. Of all the different things that realistic optimists embrace, this is probably the core one that has to be there. Okay, and what it involves is, again, I'm going to put most of my focus and energy into my effort And I'm not going to be overly focused and overly concerned about the outcome of my effort. In other words, it's not about winning. It's not about getting the A+. It's not about, everybody thinking how wonderful I am. It's about, I'm going to do my best. And I know I can't always control outcomes. In fact, I often can't control outcomes. So what can I control? I can control my effort. This kind of pushes back against our American value system. We're really big on the winner and the gold medal and the person who comes out on top. Realistic optimists don't think as much that way. They see effort as more important than outcome. And Gandhi said it there, satisfaction lies in the effort, not the attainment. Full effort is full victory. Okay, so that's a core piece of the way they think. It's not an easy way to think because we've been trained to want to win and succeed and do our, be the best. It's not about being the best. It's about doing our best. And finally, you got to have some self-compassion if you're going to be a realistic optimist. You have to be able to forgive yourself. You have to be able to take your failures and put them off to the side, learn from them, but not beat yourself up with them. And so we say realistic optimists practice the art of good enough. This may seem like blasphemy to a perfectionist, but fundamentally, the practice of good enough is, again, I did my best. And that's really the critical piece here. I've only got a minute left here, I think. But just to wrap up, I want to tell you a quick story about good enough from my own experience. About 15 so years ago, I was in a pretty negative place. I was in victim mode, external locus of control, all that stuff, okay? And I'd made some bad choices, some mistakes. I was beating myself up pretty good for it. And so, the therapist said to himself, well, you just need a vacation, So I thought, well, a long weekend maybe you'll do. And I called a friend of mine who has the proverbial cabin in the Rocky Mountains, who's also a psychologist. And I said, can I come out and just hang out at your cabin for a long weekend and reset my head? He said, sure. He said, I'm going to be there if that's okay. And another mutual friend of ours is also coming that weekend, Tom. And Tom is not a psychologist. He's a journeyman carpenter. And so I said, great, that's fine. Hopped on a plane, rented a car in Denver, drove up to the mountains, got to the cabin that night. They're already there, the psychologist and the carpenter. We have dinner together. They're having a great time talking it up. I'm the mugwump at the table. I'm beating myself up still, woe is me, all that kind of thing. We go to bed. I have a fitful sleep. I wake up the next morning, first one up, I go make coffee. And when it's ready, I grab my cup and I go out on the porch to sit down and have my morning cup of coffee. I look out and it's raining. So in my head, of course it's raining. The universe is a conspiracy against me, that kind of thing. And so I'm sitting there being the mugwump, and out comes Tom, the carpenter, with his cup of coffee. Well, Tom's one of the least psychological people I know. I mean, if he was, sitting here now, he'd probably be nodding off. But he asked me a question. He goes, Phil, how you doing? So I unload on him. I tell him, I screwed this up. I messed that up. I'm a bad person. I go through this whole thing. There's a pause, and I'm thinking I should never have talked to Tom about this. This is not his, universe. And then all of a sudden he goes, Phil, he says, you see the joists they used to build the roof over the porch? I said, sure, I see them. He goes, I can tell by looking at them. They're not quite big enough. Eventually it's going to bow. I said, okay. He says, you see the metalwork they used to join? And I said, yeah. He says, well, it's not the best. Eventually it'll corrode. I said, okay. He says, you see where the roof line of the porch meets the roof line of the cabin? I said, yeah, I see it. He says, I can tell just by looking at it, it's a little bit off. I said, great, Tom, what's your point? He says, are you dry? I said, yeah. He said, it's good enough. And then the carpenter got up and walked in the cabin and left the psychotherapist on the porch. So sometimes we have to apply that compassion that we so often want to give to other people to ourselves. And the research tells us it's much harder for most of us to be compassionate with ourselves than it is to extend that to other people. Okay, that's my wrap, and I'm sticking to it. These are a few quotes you might want to read on your own as we wrap up here. But fundamentally, again, A realistic optimist is somebody that says, I can't control the world, I can control me. And so I will make the best of what I can control and bring that out to the world through my best effort. Okay, thanks for your attention to this, and I'll turn it back over to you.